Hey, what's up, viewer? Welcome back to this tutorial series for Pong recreation. In the last video I covered the UI toolkit, which encompasses UI elements and the UI builder, for generating UI in your Unity project, similar to how you would generate UI for a website using HTML and CSS. In this video, I am going to be going over something called the input system, which is different from Unity's original input manager. This video is going to be much shorter than the last one. The last one had a lot to cover for implementing the UI builder. The input system is much more straightforward. It's much more narrow in its scope, and because the commands for this game are so low in number, this video is not going to take long at all. So the first thing I need to do is go into Git and take a look at Git branch, and since I'm on the master branch, I am going to have to switch back over to the Pong UI branch. Once I do the switch, come back into the game, it'll ask me to do a reload. I'll do the reload and we will get back to where we were at. Now here's something that's kind of weird. There's a smidge of an artifact every once in a while using the UI builder, where I'm not sure if this has something to do with Git or if it has something to do with like the editor state, but every once in a while you'll get this weird result where the UI builder will actually have these weird artifacts that are not as they're supposed to be. And the only way that I know right now how to fix this, of course, is the tried and true turn it off and turn it back on. So we're going to close the editor, and then we're going to reload the editor project. And once it reloads, it actually fixes the problem and everything goes back to the way it was. This might have something to do with how I'm switching branches in Git. I'm not entirely sure, but if you close the editor and reopen it, everything now is fixed and it goes back to how it's supposed to be. So now that we have that done, the first thing we need to do to mess around with the input system is generate something called an input action. So I'm going to select assets, I'm going to right click, go to create. I'm then going to scroll down to the very bottom here and click Input Actions. This is going to allow me to name a new Input Actions, which I'm just simply going to call Player Inputs. Once I've created this Player Inputs asset, and once it's done loading, I will double click on the Player Inputs, and this is going to bring up the actual Input Actions window. There's this nifty autosave feature which I leave on. You can turn it off if you want to, but I don't mind leaving it on. And I'm going to dock it real quick. It's not as broad as the UI builder or the visual scripting graph, so it docks in here very nicely. The first thing I'm going to do is click this plus sign and create something called an action map. And this action map I'm just going to name player, for essentially it is the player's action map. If you have separate types of behaviors for different states in your game, like maybe at some point you are running around and that's completely different than, say, you like jump on a turret or something, and you have to like you have a different, completely separate dynamic of commands, but you're using like the same inputs. Using separate action maps allows you to define those using this input system, as opposed to having to contain that state yourself in some kind of code state that you've generated. So it allows you to decouple a lot of the definitions for player inputs through this visual UI system, which is very convenient. So now that we have an action map for the player, first thing I'm going to do is come over here, and for sake of being thorough, I'm going to delete this default action map, and I'm going to create a new action using this plus sign. And this action is going to be named Move Player Paddle. Once you have created an action, you have the option to choose different types of action types. If you click value, you can do all kinds of stuff, anything from vectors to touchscreen, quaternions, directional pads. There are a lot of options. In our case, we are just going to go with, and even though this value has a button option, instead what we're going to do is go with the actual button action type. So once we have that selected, we will come down here to this binding. And as there's no binding yet, we have to give it one. So to do that, we'll come over here to binding path. We will click on this option, and this is going to open up a selector for different types of potential bindings, which cover everything from keyboard and mouse to actual HR controllers, touchscreens, pens, gamepads. There's all kinds of stuff in here. You don't have to like figure out how to build all of these interfaces yourself. The input system actually provides the ability for you to just define these inputs. Another reason why this is really convenient. So in our case, since we're keeping it simple, we are going to be doing a keyboard option. However, for convenience, we can use this listen command, and if I click this, you can actually click a button on your keyboard and it will bring up that option. So if we're moving the player paddle up, we're going to use the up arrow. So I'll click the up arrow on my keyboard, and that gives us the up arrow option. So I'm going to do the same thing for the moving the player paddle down. I'll click on this plus sign, I'll add another binding. I will go to the path, I will click listen, and I'll click the down arrow. Select the down arrow, and we have now defined the actions for moving the player paddle, which is the up arrow and the down arrow. Something I'm going to do to keep this tutorial as simple as possible, because I actually am itching to move on to a second creation series for another game. Instead of creating a AI behavior for the opposing paddle, I am just going to allow myself to control the opposing paddle using an up and down option as well. So for that, I'm going to create a new set of actions, and I'm going to call that move opposing paddle. And going through the same process, we'll click on the binding, select binding, click listen, click W, select the W key, click on the plus sign, select a new binding, click path, click listen, click S. So now we have bound W key for moving the opposing paddle up and the S key for moving the opposing paddle down. The only other keyboard input that we have is toggling the pause for the player. So we will add that here by clicking the plus sign, adding a new action, and we will call this toggle pause. And then we will select the binding. And this is a rare instance where if I actually go up here and click listen, and I push the escape key, it actually closes it. So a rare button where you can't actually listen for it. So instead we're just going to type escape and keyboard escape, select that. And we now have the toggle key set up to be the escape key. Alright, and that is actually as simple as that is. You've now defined an action map for the player, and you've now defined the actions for the player, and you've actually bound certain keyboard inputs for those actions. Very straightforward, very clean. And it's very modular. It allows you to have separate action maps that are very easy to swap. It allows you to have separate inputs if you need to change it for different types of inputs. It allows you to disconnect all of this input management from your C# code, and you don't have to know how to, and it gives you like a bunch of default input systems by default. You don't have to know how to interface with input styles that you have no clue how to deal with. A very convenient thing that Unity provides for you. One thing I will cover real quick. If I switch real quick to my start scene, and we take a look at the start and exit button, notice that we did not add a start or an exit command for the start screen. The reason for this is we are not going to... Sorry, my dog's growling at something. Instead of coming down here and defining some kind of system that tracks the mouse and tracks whenever the mouse is over the button, and then tracks when we click and make sure that we're over a button, and then when we click the button do something. Instead, the way that we're going to do button actions is we are going to use C# code using the visual scripting graph, and we're going to access the button, and we're going to assign some kind of response using C# code. That's going to be a lot more straightforward than generating an entire mouse tracking system for clicking on this button. It allows us to subscribe some kind of behavior directly to the buttons themselves. Alright, so the last thing to cover in this particular video, let me go back to the game scene, is to actually make these actions occur in the game scene. There's a special component that you need. And that component is called player input, part of the input system. So if I select player input, there are no actions yet, so I click this, and our only one is the player inputs. And It even has the separate action maps, so you can come in here and swap. You can not only swap the actions asset, but you can also swap the maps, which is pretty nifty. And it even connects this input system by default for you. So that is pretty cool. Now the other thing is that if you have a multiplayer game, this player input, if you have 2 or 3 players in the game, you can actually very easily define that there are multiple players by having separate objects with separate player inputs. And you can actually define separate types of player inputs for the separate players. It's very straightforward. And to show one more thing that I'm not going to do in this tutorial, but just something that's kind of cute, is there's also something called a player input manager, which is another way to deal with a multiplayer game setting. You can use this component to manage multiple players in the same game space, which is not something we're going to be messing with in this video, but it's just another thing to be aware of, is that the input system does support multiplayer. Alright, so as I stated, that's it for this video. Much quicker than the last video, much more straightforward. The input system is actually not too complicated. It's not nearly as intimidating as the UI builder or a visual scripting graph or any of the other graph systems. For how much power this system gives you, it is actually remarkably straightforward, so I recommend giving it a shot if you get the opportunity. If you liked this video, if you are enjoying this content so far, if you appreciate what I'm up to, do not be afraid to like, share, and subscribe to what I'm doing. And if you're really feeling up to it, please go and support me on my Patreon. I would really appreciate it. In the next video, I am finally going to dive into Unity's visual scripting graph for tying all of the previous videos together to give reactive commands to the player. I'm going to use the graph to move the ball around, to score when the ball crosses the goals, to move the paddles, to track the scores, to deal with ending the game, to pause the game, to start the game, exit the game. All of the actual nuts and bolts behavior for the game is going to be covered in the next video, and depending on how much depth that takes, I might wind up splitting it into multiple videos. So if you're interested in finally seeing all of this come together into a functioning game, make sure to come and check out the next videos that show up. So thank you very much for watching this up to this point. Take care.